Imagine a library that contains every book ever written about the human story. Floor to ceiling, wall to wall, thousands of volumes covering every era, every discovery, every fossil pulled from the earth and every gene decoded in a laboratory. You walk the aisles slowly, running your fingers along the spines. The story of Lucy. The story of the Neanderthals. The story of the first fire, the first tool, the first painted cave. It is all here, organized and labeled, waiting to be read. And then you notice something. There are gaps on the shelves. Not small gaps, entire sections where books should be but are not. You look closer and realize the gaps are not accidents. The books were never written. Not because nobody tried, but because nobody could. The information simply does not exist. The chapters are missing. And what is more unsettling than the gaps themselves is this. Nobody knows exactly what was in them. This is the true state of human evolutionary science today. We know a great deal. We know more than any generation before us, thanks to advances in ancient DNA analysis, dating technology, and fossil recovery that would have seemed like science fiction 50 years ago. But the more we learn, the more clearly we can see the shape of what we do not know. And some of what we do not know is not a small detail at the edges of the story. Some of it sits right at the center. Fundamental questions about who we were, what happened to us, and how we became the species we are today. Tonight, we are going to walk into those gaps together. We are going to look at 5 chapters of human history that science has not yet been able to fully explain. 5 mysteries that remain open, debated, and in some cases almost impossible to believe, and yet the evidence for each of them is real, peer-reviewed, and sitting in scientific journals right now. We will begin 900,000 years ago when the entire human population collapsed to fewer than 1,300 individuals, a catastrophe so severe it almost ended our story before it had properly begun, and whose cause remains unknown. We will then travel to a cave in Siberia, where a single finger bone smaller than your thumbnail revealed the existence of an entire human species that nobody had ever suspected, a ghost people whose DNA is still carried by millions of humans alive today. From there, we will descend into a cave system in South Africa, where a small-brain species did something that should have been impossible. Something that forced scientists to rewrite the rules of what intelligence actually means. We will then confront perhaps the deepest mystery of all, the moment 70,000 years ago when something switched on inside the human mind and everything changed at once and nobody can explain why. And finally, we will travel to the caves of southern China, where bones just 11,000 years old belong to a face that should not exist. A face that fits no known species, answers no current theory, and remains to this day unidentified. These are not fringe theories. These are not the claims of conspiracy websites or sensational documentaries. These are the findings of mainstream science, published, debated, and unresolved. So settle in. Let the room grow quiet around you. Let your breathing slow. Tonight we walk toward the questions that nobody has yet been able to answer. The missing chapters of the human story waiting in the dark. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine Africa. Not the Africa of today, with its cities and roads and the distant hum of human civilization pressing into every corner of the continent. Ancient Africa. 900,000 years ago. The landscape is vast and largely silent. There are no villages, no fires burning on distant hillsides, no sounds of tools being struck together in the darkness. There are animals, enormous ones, species that no longer exist, moving through grasslands and woodlands that stretch unbroken for thousands of miles. And somewhere in that immensity there are humans, our ancestors. The direct line that would eventually lead, without interruption, to every person alive on Earth today. But something is wrong. You can feel it in the silence. The groups that should be scattered across the landscape are not there. The campsites that should mark the movements of a healthy, spreading population are absent. Where there should be thousands of individuals moving through the continent, there are almost none. The land is full. The humans are not. Something has gone terribly, catastrophically wrong. And for 117,000 years, it will not get better. In 2023, a team of researchers led by Chinese geneticist Haipeng Li published a study in the journal Science that sent a quiet shock through the paleoanthropology community. The team had developed a new computational method for analyzing ancient DNA, a tool that allowed them to look at the genetic diversity present in modern human populations and work backward, like detectives reconstructing a crime from the evidence left behind, to figure out what the population that produced that DNA must have looked like thousands of generations earlier. What they found was almost impossible to believe. Approximately 900,000 years ago, the ancestral human population collapsed. Not gradually. Not slowly over millions of years in the way that evolutionary change normally works. It collapsed, dropping from a population of perhaps 100,000 or more individuals down to approximately 1,280 breeding adults. In a geological instant, roughly 98.7% of our ancestral population vanished. 1,280 individuals. That is not a large town. That is not a small town. That is a village. A single desperately small village of breeding adults, scattered across an entire continent, representing the entirety of what our lineage had left. To understand how close this came to ending everything, consider this. The mountain gorilla, one of the most endangered large primates on Earth today, an animal whose survival conservationists fight for with extraordinary effort and resources, currently has a wild population of around 1,000 individuals. Our ancestors, at their lowest point 900,000 years ago, were not much better off than the mountain gorilla is right now. And unlike the gorilla, they had no conservationists, no protected reserves, no international agreements, nothing but the blind, indifferent mathematics of survival. What makes this discovery even more staggering is its duration. This was not a brief crisis, a bad century, a terrible drought that lasted a generation and then broke. The population crash lasted approximately 117,000 years. 117,000 years of near extinction. For context, that is longer than the entire existence of our own species, Homo sapiens, from our first appearance in the fossil record to this moment tonight. For 117,000 years, the line that would produce every human being who has ever lived balanced on the edge of disappearing entirely. One epidemic. One prolonged drought lasting a few centuries longer than it did. One volcanic winter severe enough to collapse the food chains that sustained those last 1,280 individuals. And there is no story. No Lucy, no Neanderthals, no painted caves, no agriculture, no civilization. No you lying in the dark tonight listening to these words. So what caused it? This is where the mystery deepens, because the honest answer is that we do not know. The period between roughly 900,000 and 800,000 years ago is one of the most poorly documented stretches in the human fossil record. Researchers sometimes call it the silent gap, a span of time from which almost no hominin fossils have been recovered. The Earth simply did not preserve the evidence, or we have not yet found it, or there was so little human activity during this period that almost nothing was left to preserve. The silence in the fossil record and the silence implied by the genetic data reinforce each other in a way that is deeply unsettling. What we do know is that the world during this period was undergoing extraordinary environmental stress. The climate was shifting dramatically, moving into a new pattern of glacial cycles that was more severe and more volatile than anything that had come before. In Africa, this likely meant prolonged megadroughts, periods of dryness so extreme and so extended that the grasslands and woodlands our ancestors depended on for food may have simply collapsed across vast areas of the continent. Lakes dried up. Rivers shrank or disappeared. The plant and animal communities that sustained human populations fragmented and retreated. At the same time, glacial periods were tightening their grip on the northern hemisphere, locking enormous quantities of water into ice sheets and lowering global temperatures in ways that rippled across every ecosystem on Earth. Some researchers have proposed that a major volcanic eruption, or series of eruptions, may have added additional pressure, blocking sunlight and collapsing food chains already under severe stress. The most likely answer is not any single cause but a combination, a perfect storm of climate collapse, glacial pressure, and possibly volcanic catastrophe, arriving together in a window of time that pushed our ancestral population to the very edge of what a species can survive. But we cannot prove it. The silence in the fossil record means we are reconstructing this catastrophe almost entirely from the genetic shadows it left in our DNA, and genetic data, powerful as it is, cannot tell us exactly what happened on the ground, in the lives of those last desperately few individuals, during those 117,000 years of near extinction. And yet they survived. This is the part of the story that is almost as difficult to process as the catastrophe itself. From 1,280 breeding individuals, from that single fragile village scattered across a continent, every human being who has ever lived descended. The genetic bottleneck they passed through is still visible in our DNA today. Modern humans show significantly less genetic diversity than you would expect from a species our size and age, a telltale scar left by that ancient near extinction, written into every cell of every human body on Earth. The diversity you see in human faces, in human cultures, in human languages and traditions and physical forms, all of it traces back to those 1,280 survivors. They were not special in any way we can identify. They did not know they were the last. They did not know they were carrying the entire future of the human lineage in their small, struggling communities. They simply did what living things do. They found food, they sheltered from the cold and the drought, they cared for each other as best they could, and they kept going. We are all their children. Every single one of us, across every culture, every continent, every language spoken on Earth tonight, descends from that tiny group of survivors who held on through 117,000 years of catastrophe and came out the other side. They did not know what they were saving. But they saved everything. In the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, where Russia meets Mongolia and China in a knot of ancient, wind-scoured peaks, there is a cave that has been used as shelter for an almost incomprehensible stretch of time. Archaeologists have found evidence of occupation going back at least 125,000 years, and possibly much longer. The cave has 3 chambers, carved by water into the limestone of a hillside above a small river. Local people have known about it for centuries. They named it after a hermit monk named Denis, Dionysi in Russian, who is said to have lived there in the 18th century. Denis the hermit has no idea that his modest cave dwelling would one day become one of the most consequential archaeological sites in the history of human science. In 2008, researchers excavating the cave's sediment layers recovered a fragment of bone from the deepest, oldest layers of the site. It was tiny, a sliver from the tip of a finger, no larger than the nail on your little finger. It belonged to a child, probably between 5 and 13 years old. The bone was too small and too fragmentary to tell researchers much about the creature it came from based on shape or size alone. It looked, to the naked eye, like a small piece of ancient hominin bone. Interesting but not obviously extraordinary. Then they extracted the DNA. What came back from the laboratory stopped the scientific community cold. The genetic sequence did not match Homo sapiens. That was not entirely surprising. The layers it came from were old enough that a non-sapiens hominin was possible. But then the researchers compared it to the Neanderthal genome, which had recently been sequenced for the first time. It did not match that either. The DNA from this tiny finger bone, this sliver of a child's fingertip from a Siberian cave, belonged to something else entirely. A species that no one had ever identified. A species that had never appeared in the fossil record, never been named, never been suspected. An entirely new branch of the human family tree, discovered not from a dramatic skull or a complete skeleton, but from a fragment of bone small enough to lose between the cushions of a sofa. The researchers named them Denisovans, after the cave where the fragment was found. And from that moment, everything we thought we knew about human diversity in the ancient world had to be revised. What makes the Denisovans unlike any other species in the story of human evolution is the extraordinary imbalance between how little physical evidence we have of them and how much we have learned about them anyway. As of today, the total physical fossil evidence for the Denisovans consists of a finger bone fragment, a few isolated teeth, a fragment of a lower jaw found in Tibet, and a handful of other tiny fragments. No complete skull. No limb bones. No skeleton. Nothing that would allow a scientist to reconstruct what a Denisovan looked like in the way that we can reconstruct a Neanderthal or a Homo erectus from their abundant fossil remains. In any previous era of science, this would have meant almost total ignorance. You cannot build a picture of a species from a fingertip and a few teeth. But ancient DNA analysis changed the rules entirely. From those tiny fragments, researchers have extracted enough genetic information to build a remarkably detailed portrait of who the Denisovans were. Not what they looked like, but who they were in terms of their relationships, their range, and their legacy. The DNA tells us that Denisovans were cousins to the Neanderthals. The two lineages had split from a common ancestor, descended from Homo heidelbergensis, somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 years ago. While the Neanderthals spread westward into Europe and adapted to the cold of Ice Age winters there, the Denisovans spread eastward, ranging across an enormous swath of Asia, from the frozen highlands of Siberia in the north to the tropical islands of Southeast Asia in the south. The geographic range implied by the genetic evidence is staggering, larger than the range of any other archaic human species we know of, spanning climates from subarctic to tropical. How a single species could thrive across such an enormous range of environments, from the Siberian permafrost where the finger bone was found to the tropical heat of what is now Indonesia, is itself a mystery. It implies a degree of adaptability that rivals our own species, achieved by a people we cannot yet see. But the most extraordinary thing about the Denisovans is not where they lived. It is where they still live, inside us. Modern genetic analysis has revealed that Denisovans interbred with Homo sapiens, just as Neanderthals did. And in certain populations, that interbreeding left a legacy that is not merely historical but actively biological, still functioning, still maturing, in the bodies of living people today. The clearest and most remarkable example involves the people of the Tibetan Plateau, the high-altitude region of Central Asia that sits at an average elevation of over 4,500 meters above sea level. At that altitude, the air contains roughly 40% less oxygen than at sea level. For most humans, sustained life at such elevations causes serious physiological problems. Altitude sickness, reduced fertility, elevated infant mortality. Most people who try to live permanently at high altitude struggle. Tibetans do not struggle. They have lived on the plateau for thousands of years, and they carry a genetic variant, a version of a gene called EPS1, that allows their bodies to use oxygen with extraordinary efficiency at high altitude. This variant is found almost nowhere else in the human population. And when researchers looked for its origin, they found it in Denisovan DNA. The Tibetans inherited their ability to breathe on the roof of the world from a people whose fossils we have almost never found. A gift passed across hundreds of thousands of years, from a ghost species to their descendants, still working in human lungs today. Similar Denisovan genetic contributions have been identified in populations across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. The Aboriginal Australians and the peoples of Papua New Guinea carry the highest levels of Denisovan DNA of any living population, at around 3 to 5% of their genome. This tells us that Homo sapiens and Denisovans were encountering and interbreeding not just in the cold highlands of Siberia but across a wide arc of Asia and into the islands of the Pacific. Multiple meetings in multiple places across potentially hundreds of thousands of years. In 2019, the mystery deepened in a way that no one had anticipated. From the same Denisova cave where the original finger bone had been found, researchers analyzed another bone fragment and discovered something extraordinary. The individual it came from, a female teenage at the time of her death, had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. She was, in the most literal genetic sense, half and half. Researchers named her Denny. Denny is the only known first-generation hybrid between two different archaic human species ever discovered. The odds of finding such an individual in the fragmentary fossil record are almost incalculably small. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If we found her by chance in a single cave from a single fragment of bone, how common was interbreeding between archaic species actually? How much mixing, how much connection, how much shared humanity was there in that ancient world that we are only now beginning to glimpse? Why do we have so little physical evidence of the Denisovans? The answer may be partly geological. The environments they favored may not have preserved bone well over hundreds of thousands of years. It may be partly geographical. We have simply not excavated enough of the right sites in Central and Southeast Asia. Or it may be that the Denisovans, like some other archaic populations, did not consistently bury their dead in ways that would lead to fossil preservation. But every year, new analysis brings new fragments. New caves are being investigated. New methods are being developed that can extract ancient DNA from sediment alone, without any bone at all, and Denisovan DNA has already been found this way in cave sediments from sites across Asia. They are out there waiting to be found. A whole species. A whole branch of humanity. Known to us from a fingertip and a handful of teeth, and yet, in the blood of millions of living people, more present than most species that left us libraries of bones. A ghost people. But not entirely gone. Their DNA breathes in human lungs on the Tibetan plateau tonight. And somewhere in a cave not yet excavated, their story is still waiting to be told. In September of 2013, two cavers exploring the Rising Star cave system in South Africa's Cradle of Humankind, a rocky, heavily excavated region about 50 kilometers northwest of Johannesburg, squeezed through a passage so narrow that only the slimmest individuals could fit. The passage, which researchers would later name the Superman's Crawl, requires crawlers to extend one arm forward and press the other flat against their body, moving through a gap in the rock barely 20 centimeters wide in places. Beyond it lay a vertical chute dropping 12 meters into darkness. At the bottom of that chute, in a chamber that no sunlight had reached in an unknown number of years, the cavers found bones. Not a few bones. Not the scattered fragments that archaeologists typically celebrate as a significant find. Bones everywhere, covering the floor of the chamber, embedded in the sediment, piled in concentrations that suggested they had been placed rather than simply fallen. The cavers photographed what they could and brought the news back to paleoanthropologist Lee Berger at the University of the Witwatersrand. Berger recognized immediately that what had been found was extraordinary. He put out an unusual call, advertising on social media for researchers who were both qualified paleoanthropologists and small enough to fit through the Superman's Crawl. A team of 6 women, quickly nicknamed the Underground Astronauts, were selected and spent weeks descending into the chamber to carefully recover what turned out to be 1,550 individual bone fragments belonging to at least 15 separate individuals: men, women, children, and infants. It was, at the time, the single largest assemblage of hominin fossils ever recovered from a single site in Africa. Berger named the new species Homo naledi, naledi meaning star in the Sesotho language, for the rising star cave system where they were found. And then the contradictions began. The first contradiction was the brain. Homo naledi had a small brain, between 450 and 550 cubic centimeters, roughly the same size as a gorilla's, and comparable to the Australopithecus species that had lived 2 to 3 million years earlier. In the context of the hominin family tree, this was a primitive brain. A brain that, by every established theory in paleoanthropology, should not have been capable of complex symbolic thought, planning, or ritual behavior. But the chamber where the bones were found told a completely different story. The bones were not the remains of individuals who had fallen into the cave accidentally, or been washed in by flooding, or dragged in by predators. The geological evidence ruled all of those explanations out. The only explanation that fit the evidence, the only one that the cave structure and the condition of the bones supported, was that Homo naledi had been deliberately and repeatedly bringing their dead to this chamber, carrying them through the Superman's crawl, down the vertical chute, and into the darkness below. This is, by the definition used in every textbook written before 2015, mortuary behavior. The deliberate disposal of the dead in a chosen location. Behavior that was supposed to require a large, complex brain. A brain capable of abstract thought, of understanding death as a concept, of assigning meaning to the bodies of the deceased. Homo naledi's brain was less than half the size of a modern human's. And yet the evidence that they were engaging in this behavior is, according to the researchers who have studied it most carefully, extremely difficult to explain any other way. The second contradiction was the age. When Homo naledi was first announced in 2015, the assumption, based largely on the primitive features of the skeleton, was that it was very old. Perhaps 2 to 3 million years, placing it alongside the Australopithecus species it physically resembled. This would have been remarkable enough. But when the bones were finally dated using uranium thorium and paleomagnetism methods in 2017, the results were shocking in a completely different direction. Homo naledi was not 2 million years old. It was between 250,000 and 335,000 years old. This single number changed everything. At 250,000 to 335,000 years ago, Homo naledi was not an ancient ancestor living in a world before modern humans existed. It was a contemporary. Homo sapiens, our own species, had already appeared in Africa by 300,000 years ago, as the Jebel Irhoud fossils in Morocco confirm. Which means that Homo naledi, with its small gorilla-sized brain and its ancient-looking skeleton, was alive at the same time as early Homo sapiens. Two radically different human species, existing simultaneously on the same continent. One with a brain 3 times the size of the other. The story of human evolution had always been told as a progression. Each species replacing the last, the brain growing steadily larger, the behavior growing steadily more complex. Homo naledi shattered that narrative completely. Evolution, it turns out, was running multiple experiments simultaneously, and some of those experiments looked nothing like what we expected. And then Lee Berger made claims that divided the scientific community entirely. In 2023, Berger and his team announced that they had found evidence of cave markings, geometric shapes and crosshatch patterns, on the walls of chambers in the rising star system, in areas accessible only through the same narrow passages that led to the bone chamber. They also reported finding stone tools in association with Homo naledi remains. If these claims are correct, they would mean that Homo naledi was not only burying its dead but also making marks on cave walls, engaging in the kind of symbolic, artistic behavior that had previously been considered the exclusive domain of large-brained hominins like Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. The reaction from other researchers was immediate and largely skeptical. Critics pointed out that the cave markings had not been conclusively proven to have been made by Homo naledi rather than by other species who may have also used the cave system. The dating of the marks and their association with Homo naledi specifically was questioned. Several prominent paleoanthropologists argued that the evidence, while intriguing, fell well short of proof. Berger's team held their ground. The debate continues in journals and at conferences, unresolved. But here is what is not debated. The bones are real, the chamber is real, and the only explanation that fits the physical evidence for how those bones got there is deliberate, repeated mortuary behavior by a species with a brain the size of a gorilla's. That alone, without the cave art, without the tools, without any of Berger's more controversial claims, is enough to force a fundamental rethinking of what we thought we understood about the relationship between brain size and complex behavior. For most of the history of paleoanthropology, brain size was treated almost as a synonym for cognitive ability. Bigger brain meant smarter species meant more complex behavior. It was a clean, satisfying equation that organized the entire story of human evolution into a neat upward progression. Homonality does not fit that equation. It cannot be made to fit. A species with a brain comparable to animals we do not credit with symbolic thought was, by the best available evidence, engaging in behavior that we have always considered the mark of a mind capable of understanding its own mortality. What does that mean? It means the equation was wrong, or at least far too simple. It means that the relationship between brain size, intelligence, and behavior in the hominin lineage is more complex, more varied, and more surprising than a century of research had led us to believe. It means that there may have been forms of thought, forms of meaning-making, forms of what we might cautiously call inner life, distributed across the hominin family tree in ways we are only beginning to understand. A species thought for centuries. Long before anyone was looking. Long before anyone thought to look in a cave that could only be reached by squeezing through a gap in the rock barely wide enough to breathe in. They were small-brained by our measures. They were not, it seems, small-minded. And nobody gave them credit for it, because nobody knew they were there. Imagine two photographs taken of the same African landscape, separated by what, in geological terms, is barely a heartbeat. In the first photograph, taken approximately 80,000 years ago, you see a small group of Homo sapiens living in a way that would have been recognizable to any hominin species that came before them. They make stone tools, serviceable, effective, but not dramatically different from tools made by Neanderthals or even late Homo erectus populations. They eat, they sleep, they move through the landscape following food and water. They communicate, certainly they do, but the evidence of anything we might call symbolic thought, anything that reaches beyond the immediate practical demands of survival, is thin and scattered and disputed. In the second photograph, taken perhaps 10,000 years later, everything has changed. The same species is now making art, not accidental marks, not functional scratches, but deliberate, skillful representations of the world rendered in ochre and charcoal on cave walls and carved into bone and shell. They are making music, flutes carved from vulture bone and mammoth ivory, capable of producing a range of notes, found at sites across Europe dating to around 40,000 years ago. They are trading, moving shells, ochre, and stone tools hundreds of kilometers from their sources along networks that imply relationships between groups who have never met face to face. They are burying their dead with grave goods, tools, ornaments, pigment, placed with the body in ways that suggest beliefs about what death means and what, if anything, comes after it. And they are doing all of this not in one place, not in one population, but across a vast arc of the world simultaneously. Something happened. Something switched on. And nobody, despite decades of research, despite the full power of modern genetics and archaeology and neuroscience brought to bear on the question, can tell us with certainty what it was. This is the cognitive revolution. And the mystery at its heart is not what happened, but why then. Homo sapiens had existed, in anatomically modern form, for at least 300,000 years before the cognitive revolution. For those 300,000 years, a span of time more than twice the length of everything that has happened since, our ancestors were walking the earth with brains essentially identical in size and basic structure to the one you are using right now to process these words. They were not cognitively primitive in any anatomical sense. The hardware was there. And yet the explosion of behavior that defines the cognitive revolution, the art, the music, the trade, the ritual, the storytelling, did not appear for 300,000 years. What was the software waiting for? The first and perhaps most elegant theory points to genetics, specifically to a single gene called FOXP2, sometimes nicknamed the language gene, though that description is an oversimplification that makes geneticists uncomfortable. FOXP2 is a regulatory gene. It controls the activity of hundreds of other genes, many of them involved in the development and fine motor control of the mouth, throat, and the neural circuits that coordinate the rapid, precise muscular movements that spoken language requires. Humans carry a version of FOXP2 that differs from the version found in chimpanzees at two specific points in the genetic sequence. These two changes, which occurred somewhere in the human lineage after the split from chimpanzees, appear to have dramatically enhanced the fine motor control and neural connectivity involved in speech production. The theory proposes that a mutation or a series of mutations in or around FOXP2 or related genes occurred approximately 70,000 years ago in a population of Homo sapiens in Africa, giving that population a qualitative leap in language capability. True language, not just calls and gestures and learned signals, but the ability to combine symbols in infinitely variable ways to express infinitely variable thoughts, then unlocked everything else. With true language came the ability to share complex ideas, to plan across time, to teach skills without physical demonstration, to coordinate group behavior at a scale and sophistication that had never been possible before. It is a compelling theory. It is also impossible to prove from the fossil and genetic record we currently have, and many researchers find the idea of a single mutation producing such a sweeping change implausible. Evolution rarely works in single dramatic steps. The second theory points not inward to genetics but outward to catastrophe, specifically to one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the last 2 million years of Earth history. Approximately 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano on the island of Sumatra, the Toba caldera, erupted with a force estimated at 5,000 times that of the Mount St. Helens eruption of 1980. The eruption ejected an enormous quantity of ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and triggering what researchers call a volcanic winter, a period of dramatically reduced temperatures and collapsed food chains that may have lasted for years or even decades. Some researchers have argued that the Toba eruption pushed the global human population through a genetic bottleneck similar to the one we discussed earlier, reducing it to perhaps a few thousand individuals in isolated refugia where conditions remain survivable. The Toba catastrophe theory, as it is known, proposes that the extreme pressure of near extinction forced the surviving populations to develop new levels of social complexity and cooperation simply to survive. The groups that made it through were those that could communicate most effectively, share resources most efficiently, and coordinate behavior most flexibly. The catastrophe, in this reading, was the pressure that forced the cognitive leap, the evolutionary crucible in which modern human behavior was forged. The theory is elegant and dramatic. It is also contested. Genetic and archaeological evidence from South Africa suggests that human populations there survived the Toba eruption without a dramatic bottleneck, and continued making sophisticated tools through the period of the eruption without an obvious break. If Toba nearly destroyed humanity, the evidence for that near destruction is surprisingly patchy. The third theory is quieter and in some ways more unsettling than either of the first two. It proposes that the cognitive revolution was not caused by a new genetic mutation or an external catastrophe, but by climate, specifically by the rapid, volatile climate fluctuations that characterized the period between 80,000 and 60,000 years ago in Africa and across the world. This theory argues that extended periods of environmental stability allow populations to settle into behavioral routines that work well enough. It is only when the environment becomes unpredictable, when the rains fail for a century and then return, when food sources appear and disappear, when the landscape itself becomes unreliable, that there is strong selective pressure for the kind of flexible, innovative, symbol-based thinking that the cognitive revolution represents. Populations that could think abstractly, plan for multiple possible futures, share information about distant resources through language and story, those populations survived the instability. Those that could not, did not. In this reading, the cognitive revolution was not a sudden switch but the end point of a long ratchet, behavioral complexity building gradually under climate pressure, until it crossed some threshold and became visible in the archaeological record all at once. The fourth theory is perhaps the most radical of all, and in some ways the most difficult to dismiss. It proposes that the cognitive revolution never happened. Not in the sense of a real event that occurred 70,000 years ago, but as an archaeological artifact. A gap in our evidence rather than a gap in human capability. The theory argues that the full range of modern human behavior, language, symbolic thought, art, ritual, was present in Homo sapiens from the beginning or close to it. The reason it does not appear in the archaeological record until around 70,000 to 40,000 years ago is not because it did not exist before that, but because the conditions for its preservation and our ability to find and recognize it were simply not in place earlier. Proponents of this view point to isolated finds of early symbolic behavior, the ochre engravings at Blombos Cave dating to 75,000 years ago, pigment use going back 160,000 years, shell beads from North Africa dating to 130,000 years, and argue that these are glimpses of a capability that was always there, surfacing occasionally in the record and then disappearing not because the behavior stopped but because the evidence did not survive. If this theory is correct, then the cognitive revolution is not a revolution at all. It is a visibility threshold, the point at which human behavior became complex enough, widespread enough, and durable enough in its materials to leave a clear mark in the archaeological record. None of these four theories has won the argument. Each has evidence in its favor and evidence against it. Each has serious researchers who defend it and serious researchers who challenge it. The honest position, the position that the evidence currently supports, is that we do not know what caused the cognitive revolution, or even whether it was a discrete event rather than a gradual process that only looks sudden from the distance of deep time. What we know is the result. A species that had existed for 300,000 years without leaving a clear mark on the world beyond stone tools suddenly began painting caves, carving flutes, trading across continents, burying its dead with ceremony, and telling stories that gave meaning to the darkness and the stars. We know what we became. We do not know the moment we became it. And perhaps that is the deepest mystery of all, not the origin of our tools or our art or our language, but the origin of the mind that made them. The moment when the lights came on inside a human skull and something looked out at the world and began for the first time to wonder. We do not know when that moment was. We do not know what caused it. We only know that it happened because here we are, still wondering. The greatest mystery of our own species is the mystery of ourselves. We do not know when we became us. In 1989, in a cave called Malyadong Red Deer Cave, in Yunnan province in southwestern China, archaeologists made a discovery that they did not fully understand for more than 2 decades. Bones were found in the cave sediment, along with the remains of the extinct giant red deer that gave the site its name. The bones were set aside, catalogued, stored. The full analysis would have to wait. It waited until 2012, when an international team of researchers finally completed a thorough examination of the Malyadong fossils, and connected them to similar bones found at a second site called Longlin Cave, also in Yunnan province. What they published stopped the paleoanthropology community in its tracks. The bones were unusual. Not ancient unusual, not the kind of unusual that comes from great age and fossilization. Structurally unusual. The skulls and jaw bones showed a combination of features that did not match any known human species. Not modern Homo sapiens, not Neanderthals, not any of the archaic species that the Asian fossil record had previously produced. And the date? The bones from Malyadong were between 11,500 and 14,500 years old. The Longlin individual was approximately 11,000 years old. 11,000 years ago. In a world that was supposed to contain only one human species. To understand why this matters so deeply, you have to understand what the world looked like 11,000 years ago. This is not deep prehistoric time. This is practically recent by the standards of human evolution. Agriculture was just beginning to emerge in the Fertile Crescent. The last woolly mammoths were still alive on isolated Arctic islands. The first permanent human settlements were appearing in the Middle East. In China, human populations were already well established, making pottery, developing complex tools, living in organized communities. 11,000 years ago, every paleoanthropologist on Earth would have told you with complete confidence that the only human species left alive anywhere on the planet was Homo sapiens. The Neanderthals had been gone for 30,000 years. The Denisovans had apparently disappeared. Homo erectus had been extinct for over 100,000 years. Homo floresiensis, the tiny island species found on the Indonesian island of Flores, had vanished around 50,000 years ago. The world was ours. Entirely, exclusively ours. And yet in a cave in southern China, something was living that did not fit that picture. The physical features of the Red Deer Cave people are what make them so difficult to explain. The research team, led by Darren Curnow of the University of New South Wales and Ji Shueping of the Yunnan Institute of Cultural Relics and Archaeology, described a mosaic of features. Some ancient, some modern, some that did not clearly belong to either category. The skulls were large and rounded at the back, a modern feature. But the faces were flat and broad, with wide noses, features more typical of archaic hominins than of the anatomically modern humans living elsewhere in the world at the same time. The brow ridges were prominent, heavier than in modern humans. The chins were absent or very weakly developed, a feature that modern humans have but that archaic species typically do not. The brain cases were thick-walled, a primitive characteristic. The molars were large, very large, more similar in size to ancient hominins than to contemporary modern humans. No single feature taken alone would necessarily be alarming. Modern human populations show enormous variation, and some features that look archaic in isolation can appear in modern individuals. But the combination, the specific constellation of ancient and modern characteristics appearing together in these individuals, did not match any known population of Homo sapiens, ancient or modern, anywhere in the fossil record. Who were they? The research team proposed 3 possible explanations, and 2 decades of subsequent work have not definitively eliminated any of them. The first possibility is that the Red Deer Cave people represent a previously unknown archaic human species, a population that had somehow survived in the isolated, heavily forested mountains of southwestern China long after all other archaic human species had disappeared everywhere else on Earth. Southern China's terrain is extraordinarily rugged and fragmented, with deep river valleys and dense forest creating natural barriers that could, in theory, have isolated a small population for tens of thousands of years. In this scenario, the Red Deer Cave people are the last remnant of an ancient lineage, a ghost population surviving into an era that should have belonged entirely to Homo sapiens. The second possibility is that the Red Deer Cave people are not a separate species at all, but an early and genetically distinct population of Homo sapiens, a group that had been isolated long enough to develop a distinctive physical appearance that included some features that look archaic but are simply the result of drift and local adaptation rather than actual ancient ancestry. Human populations isolated for thousands of generations can diverge significantly in physical appearance without crossing the boundary into a separate species. The third possibility, and perhaps the most intriguing, is that the Red Deer Cave people are the result of interbreeding between a population of anatomically modern Homo sapiens and an archaic hominin species that was still present in southern China at that time. A hybrid population, carrying the physical imprint of both lineages, surviving in an isolated corner of the continent. Given what we now know about interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, and between Homo sapiens and Denisovans, this possibility is no longer the fringe idea it might once have seemed. The problem, the fundamental, maddening problem, is that we cannot get ancient DNA from the Red Deer Cave bones. Ancient DNA degrades over time, and the rate of degradation is strongly influenced by temperature and humidity. Cold, dry environments, like the Siberian permafrost where the Denisovan finger bone was found, are extraordinarily good at preserving ancient genetic material. Warm, humid environments, like the cave systems of subtropical southwestern China, are extraordinarily bad at it. The heat and moisture break down the DNA molecules over thousands of years until nothing readable remains. Every technique available to modern ancient DNA researchers has been applied to the Red Deer Cave fossils. Nothing usable has been recovered. The genetic answer to the question of who these people were is locked inside bones that will not give it up. Without DNA, researchers are left with morphology, the physical shape of the bones, and morphology alone cannot definitively answer the question of species identity. It can tell you that something looks different. It cannot tell you with certainty whether that difference represents a separate species, a divergent population of the same species, or a hybrid of two lineages meeting in an isolated valley. And so the Red Deer Cave people sit in the scientific literature in a state of unresolved suspension. Described, analyzed, debated, and ultimately unexplained. Their bones are real. Their unusual features are real. Their age is real. What they were remains, more than a decade after their formal description, genuinely unknown. There is something quietly extraordinary about this mystery that sets it apart from the others we have explored tonight. The 900,000-year population crash happened so long ago that its causes are buried under almost a million years of geological time. The Denisovans are known only from a handful of fragments from which we have been fortunate enough to extract ancient DNA. Homo naledi lived in a period when multiple hominin species were still part of the African landscape. The cognitive revolution happened in a world so different from our own that its triggers are almost impossible to reconstruct. But the Red Deer Cave people were alive 11,000 years ago. In human terms, 11,000 years is not very long. It is roughly 500 generations. If you could line up your ancestors in a chain, parent to great-grandparent, going back generation by generation, you would reach the time of the Red Deer Cave people in about 500 steps. That is not an incomprehensible distance. That is a long hallway. And at the end of that hallway, in a cave in southwestern China, something was living that we cannot explain. Something that had a face unlike any modern human face, a jaw unlike any modern human jaw, a physical form that carries the echoes of species that were supposed to be long gone, and yet was alive in a world that was already, in almost every other place on Earth, recognizably the human world we inhabit today. They cooked the giant red deer whose bones share their cave. They sheltered from the same rains that fall on Yunnan province today. They looked up at the same stars. And we do not know what they were. Not an ancient mystery buried in the deep past. A recent one. A mystery from practically around the corner of human time, waiting in a cave in southern China for an answer that the science as it currently stands cannot provide. 11,000 years ago they were there. We still do not know who they were. And perhaps that is the most unsettling thought of all, that the last chapter of the human family story is not written in the deep past, in the 7 million-year journey we have traced tonight, but in a cave just around the corner of history, holding a secret that the bones refuse to tell. We began tonight with the image of a library, vast, ancient, and full of gaps. Shelves where books should be but are not. Chapters that were never written, not because nobody tried but because the evidence simply does not exist. And now, having walked through 5 of the deepest and most unsettling of those gaps, we can see the shape of what is missing more clearly than when we started. A population of barely 1,280 souls, clinging to existence through 117,000 years of catastrophe whose cause we still cannot name with certainty. A ghost people known from a fingertip, whose DNA breathes in human lungs on the Tibetan plateau tonight. A small-brained species descending into darkness to lay their dead to rest, thousands of years before anyone thought that possible. A cognitive explosion that transformed a species overnight, or gradually, or perhaps not at all, and whose trigger remains one of the most debated questions in all of science. And a face from just 11,000 years ago, from practically around the corner of human time, that no one can identify, explain, or place in any known chapter of our story. 5 mysteries. 5 open doors. 5 places where the map of human history simply ends and the unknown begins. And here is what connects them, what makes them not 5 separate puzzles but one single, continuous truth. The story of what we are is not finished. It was never finished. Every answer we have found has opened 3 new questions. Every fossil pulled from the earth has complicated the picture rather than completed it. Every strand of ancient DNA decoded has revealed not just what we knew but the vast shadow of what we still do not know. This is not a failure of science. This is science working exactly as it should. The greatest discoveries in human evolutionary research have not been the moments when a question was finally closed, but the moments when a question was opened that no one had thought to ask. Nobody asked about the Denisovans before 2010, because nobody knew they existed. Nobody asked why Homo naledi was burying its dead because nobody believed it could. Nobody knew to look for a population crash 900,000 years ago, because the tools to see it did not exist until recently. The map keeps growing. The territory keeps expanding. And the most honest thing any scientist can say about the human story is this: we are only beginning. There is something deeply, specifically human about this situation. We are the only species that digs up its own ancestors and asks who they were. We are the only species that looks at a finger bone and sees not just calcium and protein but a story, a life, a people, a chapter of a shared history that belongs to all of us. The questions we ask about our past are not separate from what we are. They are a definition of what we are. To wonder where we came from is to be human. It has always been. So take these questions with you into the dark tonight. The crash that almost ended us. The ghost people whose DNA still lives in us. The small-brained species that understood grief. The revolution that no one can explain. The face that no one can name. You do not need to solve them. Nobody has. Let them rest in the quiet part of your mind the way the best questions always do, not demanding answers, just keeping you company in the dark. Some answers only come in dreams. This has been Sleep While Learning. Thank you for spending this night with the missing chapters of the human story. Sleep well, and remember, the most extraordinary thing about being human is not what we know. It is everything we are still searching for.